Hi everybody, Kat here. Thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to be painting a cheerful peacock using mostly a controlled wet on wet technique. So I have a sketch at the end of the video, and I'll be showing you my favorite gold paint. Right now I'm using a wax crayon to resist the water in the paint, just where the quill is, the shaft of where the feathers grow out of. I have 3 brushes, fairly small, medium to small, and these are the colors I'm going to be using. Actually, I don't know that I used the Van Dyke Brown in the end. I can't remember. So this is a funky brush I got from the dollar store, and I'll show you an alternative later if you can't get your hands on one of those. And nice clean water. When you're working, anytime you're working wet on wet, you want nice clean water. So right here, I'm just waking up my paints with a couple of drops of water. If you don't have an eyedropper, you just use your paintbrush and add a few drops. So I'm going to start with the body of the peacock. So I'm wetting it first. And if you notice, I'm just going beyond the body. Like I want this body to sort of bleed into the blanket of feathers. So that you'll see that more later on. So I'm just taking some marine blue and popping that in. Or that might be the cobalt. I'm not too sure on when you're editing. It's kind of a small window. So I think that's the marine blue. It doesn't matter. You use whatever colors you like to look at together. I think these complement each other well, but they don't make mud when they mix. And that's an important thing to remember when you are painting wet on wet. When these paints merge, they're going to make like a purpley mauvey kind of color rather than a mud. For example, if you used a blue and an orange, they are complementary colors, so they would neutralize each other, therefore making your painting a little murky. So try to use colors beside each other on the color wheel and not opposite each other on the color wheel. Now I'm pulling with a wet brush. I'm kind of drawing that paint down, and I'm doing it around the eye of the feathers. So the background of the eyes, behind the eyes, it's going to be pink. I'm going to start with the magenta. And you'll see later that you're not going to see very much of that pink. This is just the foundation of the tail. So I'm using a very watery dilution of the magenta. Sometimes I go in, because it's a staining color. So if you don't wet your paper enough and you put down a stroke of pink, it's going to leave a stain, which is going to be very hard to remove after. It's going to leave a hard line. The good thing is you will be covering most of this up with feathers later on. Let it dry, and when you come back, you're going to wet the eye of the feathers. So just do 3 or 4 at a time, otherwise your paper will dry. So you notice I'm pressing down on my brush, using the belly of the brush to spread that water out. So there's no puddles, but it's nice and wet. And now the paint I'm using is quite watery as well. But if you notice, it won't go beyond where I wet the eye of the feather. It won't go beyond that. And that's the nature of watercolor. So this is a controlled wet on wet technique. If I had wet the entire tail, these blue spots would bleed right into the pink. And I didn't want that. Now this is a much creamier consistency. And I'm just putting down like a darker edge on these. And you'll see it when I get to the bigger feathers a little more easily. And you see that the blue part is still wet. And I'm going in, there's my nice creamy paint. It's very creamy. And I'm going to paint in the center. And what that'll give me is a nice soft edge, but it will retain its shape. Make sure you dry your ferrule of your brush. Make sure there's no beads of water because they'll roll down and make a mess. So now here's the bigger eyes of the feathers. As you can see, I've done a whole bunch. And I wet those first, and you can see a little bit better how the paint reacts and where it goes. Now, I could have used a larger brush, but if you're a beginner, I definitely recommend using a smaller one and taking your time. I'm a slow painter. I'm not a very fast painter, so this worked for me quite well. And sometimes when you have a larger brush, it holds a lot more water. And then if it's too watery, you're going to get cauliflowers, which are kind of hard lines. And I didn't want that. Now I want to show you something here. When you're working wet on wet, you'll often notice that when you lift your brush off, you get, right as the brush lifts off the paper, you get this final drop of paint, and it spreads out, and it's not very appealing most of the time. So what I recommend you do is you just make your brush nice and dry, and then you run it along that edge that you want to clean up. And you see it takes away those ugly little blotches. They're not desirable unless you're doing it really abstract and you don't mind. So now I'm using the cobalt blue for the centers. As I said, you don't have to use these colors, just something darker than your large center. Looks like an egg yolk to me. And this is very creamy paint. So again, it's going to hold its shape, but have soft edges. With practice, you'll soon be able to gauge how thick your paint needs to be based on how wet your paper is. Dry again. And now I'm making a green color. I just want to put an outline around the eyes of the eye of the feather, just to make it stand out. Some peacocks are really bright and others are not so bright. The males tend to be quite bright. And this is creamy paint. And you'll notice, because the paper's dry, it's not going anywhere other than where I painted. It's going to stay exactly where I put it. So this is called wet on dry, because your paint is wet and your paper is dry. Mostly it's not important to remember the names of the techniques, it's just important to remember how to do them. So now I'm just taking a wet brush and I'm softening that magenta because it was a little bit clumpy when it dried, and it didn't look very appealing. So now where I drew the quills, the shaft of the feathers and the eyes, I want it to give it some dimension. So I'm going to go around it with some very watery magenta, and I'm using two brushes here so that I find it a little easier to work that way. So one is just wet and the other one has the paint on it. And again, I want it always to stay soft. I don't want any hard lines here. And where I'm going around the quill here, I don't mind it if it's a little hard on the inside edge. This will barely show after the layers are put on of feathers, but it does make an impact. So every layer counts in watercolor. Even though you don't think it does, it really does. So do whatever you're comfortable with. If you'd like to wet first, then add your color, or add your watery color and then soften it out. I do a bit of both. So now I'm going to I'm going to outline the eye, just to sharpen those edges, because I did this wet on wet earlier. So now this is wet on dry. And while I don't necessarily need a lot of details, I do want to make sure the body doesn't look sloppy or forgotten about. I want all those colors to gently merge and make dreamy effects. And I'm using some raw sienna for the beak. And that's a little watery there, so I'm gonna, you know, dab some up a little bit, and I'll reapply a thicker bit on the bottom of the beak. Gives it a little bit of shape. And now I'm mixing some blue with the magenta to make like a purple. And then when you add that to yellow, they kind of neutralize each other. And that's just for the nostrils and a little bit of shape and the opening of the beak. That line that you see there, right in the center. And black for the eye, trying to leave a tiny little glint, but this is a pretty small paper. This is a 9x6, so it's not going to show very much. And now I'm doing the crest. I'm going to do the whole thing in marine blue, and this is like a peachy kind of color I mixed up just for those, I don't know what they're called, part of the crest, but I didn't want them to be blue. So I just made a brownie kind of color. And now to those little blue dots, I'm going to add some magenta to make them stand out a little more. Later on, I put a little dabs of gold on them. So now I want the body to flow into the bed of the blanket of feathers. So I'm wetting the bottom of the bird's body, and I'm dropping in some magenta and some marine blue, and I'm going to draw it down into the bed of feathers without turning that whole thing blue or purple. It's just going to be kind of subtle. I'm gently dabbing at the paint with a fairly wet brush, making a path of sorts for it to follow. Now this is if you don't have one of those funky dollar store brushes, I just took an old brush and you can cut into it and it kind of gives you the same effect. And this is a terrific brush for painting grasses or fur. It really saves a ton of time because I'm not one to like to make, you know, millions of strokes like this with a tiny little brush. I don't find that fun or relaxing. So this is my phthalo blue. If you have Viridian, you can use that. And this is some cobalt. And I mix kind of the two, I alternate, and I'm just making these kind of feathery shapes around the eyes of the feathers. I don't know what you call, if there's a, I'm sure there's a scientific name. I just don't know what that is. And now I'm using a darker version of the Viridian, the phthalo. And that's what it looked like before the gold. So this is Schminke Aqua Bronze Metallic Pigment. And it's a powder. So what you do is you take a little bit out, and a little bit goes a long way. And I put it in a little container, and I mix it with water, and it takes a good mixing. You really have to mix it, and look at that. I mean, it looks like a bar of gold. And so what I decided to do to give this peacock a little more oomph, I decided to go around all the eyes of the feathers with this gold, and it really did make the painting. And I wish you could see this in person. The gold is absolutely beautiful. And they have, Schminke has, I think there's copper, bronze, silver, whatever have you. Quite beautiful, but this is pale gold. And they have another gold too, another rich gold, I think it's called. I just ordered this one to try, and because I like it so much, then I can order the next one. I think I will try the silver because I use this a lot in Christmas card painting, and I really quite like that. And I have such a hard time finding, I must own 10 different gold paints and I hate them all, except this one. So I just continue to go around all the eyes, and I let the feathers the gold kind of cover some of those eyes. and drape over them, and I like how that looks. Now I decided to put some dots in there, and they end up looking like eyeballs, but that's okay. It kind of worked out. Look at that, it's so beautiful. I did some close-ups so that you could see that gold paint in action. And I decided to put some on the beak and a little bit on the crest, and that's it. This is my beautiful peacock. Look at that. So shiny. So I hope you found this helpful and you get a little less afraid to work wet on wet. If you like this video, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, everybody. Happy watercoloring. Bye-bye.